When most people think of the first year of the Great Northern War, they tend to think about the Battle of Narva, the decisive Swedish victory over the Russian army in the November of 1700. Those more familiar with the conflict may also recall that the war was in fact begun by a surprise attack by the Saxon army to Swedish Livonia in the first months of the year, as well as the famous Swedish landing at Humleback in the late summer, which forced the Danish to make peace within months of declaration of war, and leaving Sweden with only Russia and Saxony as its enemies. But why was Charles XII able to just waltz to Copenhagen relatively unopposed? Where was the Danish army at the time, if not threatening Sweden or defending their own capital? In this series of videos, I will try and cover a forgotten campaign of the Great Northern War, the Holstein Campaign, as well as play out some war games based on the forces present at the campaign. The history of Holstein-Gottorp is very long and complicated, stemming from dynastic and imperial troubles spanning from the Middle Ages, but the gist of the geopolitical situation is thus. At the close of the 17th century, Holstein-Gottorp is situated in the southern part of the Jutland peninsula. The area known as Holstein is split into a patchwork of various claims and ownerships, mostly between the King of Denmark and the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. One of the main issues of contention became the dynastic ties formed between the Swedish monarchy and the Dukes of Holstein-Gottorp. The German possessions of Sweden in Bremen and Pomerania, combined with the territories of the Dukes of Holstein, would leave Denmark vulnerable to attack from the south, and dynastic links between the Dukes of Holstein and the Swedish monarchs might eventually cause the Swedes to argue for claims on Danish possessions in the southern parts of the Jutland Peninsula. The Dukes of Holstein had also begun building modern fortifications, as well as smaller redoubts to help in the defense of the duchy in case of Danish aggression. The crown jewel of these fortifications was the Tönning Fortress, a modern star fort from which the small army of Holstein was supplied from. The building of these redoubts was however taken to be a breach of the terms of the treaty between Denmark and Holstein, and this was used by the Danish king as a justification for the declaration of war on Holstein, shortly after the Saxons had begun the Great Northern War with their surprise attack on the city of Riga. However, the Danish king, Frederick IV, was playing a dangerous political game. The Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp was guaranteed by numerous other nations that otherwise would have had no greater stake in the conflict between Denmark and Sweden. The maritime powers under William III, as well as the duchies of Hanover-Brunswick and Celle-Lüneburg, had all guaranteed the independence of the Duchy of Holstein in the Treaty of Altona. As such, the Danish king was mostly preoccupied in a flurry of political discourse between the various dukes and princes of northern Germany, between his coalition allies in Saxony and Russia, and he also hoped to dissuade the maritime powers from intervening in the war through diplomatic means, arguing that Holstein had already breached the terms of the Altona Treaty by building these extensive fortifications. Frederick IV knew, however, there would be one army that the Danes could not appease diplomatically, that of their archenemy Sweden. The Duke of Württemberg-Neuenstadt, Ferdinand Wilhelm, was given command of the Danish army, and he was given two explicit tasks: to quickly capitulate the Duchy of Holstein and to stop any attempts by a Swedish army of arriving to the duchy to aid them. For the immediate moment, the Danes were not too worried of an amphibious attack from Sweden. The fleets of Sweden and Denmark were roughly of equal size, and it was unlikely that they would commit to a large-scale naval invasion or battle unless absolutely necessary. As such, the main threat of a Swedish army came from the south, where forces from the Swedish-German possessions in Bremen and Swedish Pomerania could strike north toward Holstein. The duchies of Hannover-Brunswick and Celle-Lüneburg were also situated to the south, and might join the Swedish army as guarantors of the Altona Treaty. Duke Ferdinand Wilhelm decided on a bold strategic maneuver. To protect the southern front, he divided the Danish army in two, giving command of the other half of the army to his brother Karl Rudolf, who would later distinguish himself as the commander of the Danish troops in Marlborough's army during the War of the Spanish Succession. This force contained most of the Danish cavalry and dragoons, as well as some 2,000 infantry. They would be tasked with delaying and preventing any Swedish force sent from Pomerania or Bremen from entering Holstein, while the other part of the army would siege down the major towns and fortifications of the duchy. The rest of the army was divided into two siege columns. The first column was commanded by the Duke himself and contained most of the siege artillery and the Danish Guard infantry, while the second column, commanded by General Fuchs, while smaller, had slightly more cavalry. These two columns would take different roads to the major towns of Western Holstein, Friedrichstad and Husum, and then converge together to siege the fortress of Tönning, the taking of which would practically force the capitulation of the army of Holstein. Even split into two columns as such, each column would still be roughly as large as the entire army of Holstein, both numbering roughly 500 cavalry and 4,000 infantry. The two columns set out on the 6th of April 1700, moving into Holsteinian territory. The Holstein Campaign was now underway.